So the piece is, it's a solo lecture of this kind of like uptight woman who is informing people about complex post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder, and kind of looking at what are the key elements of that and how it differs to post-traumatic stress disorder. But during the course of the lecture, her body starts to rebel against her and ends up sort of taking over. The body kind of ends up taking over.
Obviously, the significance of the body taking over is because that is a strong element of c-ptsd. Is that correct?
Yeah. It was probably one of the defining factors of my experience of trauma, was my body almost like screaming at me that something was wrong. Like my mind was completely oblivious, or like my frontal part of my mind was oblivious, but my back part of my mind was in a lot of distress. And so it was like my body was talking to me in very strange, and at the time unreadable ways. So one of the big things I had was involuntary spasms, and I went through a period of like chucking things. Often I'd like have a glass of water in my hand and I would chuck the water over myself.
Right.
So it was like my body was like, wake up,
right,
look what's going on.
Wow.
Or I'd like drop something and it would make such a noise, and it was like this almost like temporary loss of control that was, and like lots of trauma experts will talk about this, is that the body needs to release the chemicals that get stored during traumatic events. And so what happens to, particularly to animals in the wild, is they will shake after a traumatic event. And there's something around that, I think, in what can happen to a person when they have a, you know, deeply repressed experience of something traumatic. So the piece was very much an attempt to kind of externalize that experience. And I think really, like, it took me roughly about 10 years to make that piece, on and off. And it kind of had different manifestations at different points in time. And it wasn't really until getting involved in the Cabaret and kind of working on it with you guys that it became what it is now, which I think is kind of like a like it's become conscious in a way. Like before it was like an unconscious idea that was trying to find its way out. And with your help, with your very brilliant eyes on it, it's become its own entity, I think.
And it's just so incredible, because to hear you talking about it and to imagine that, it must have been very scary, and like you had no control over your body, over your mind. You know, it must have been really very frightening. And to use comedy and clowning to process what must have been a very difficult time is incredible. And also, I mean, to hear you explain it sounds very complicated. It sounds complex and very deep rooted. To watch the piece, it's hilarious. It's a brilliant piece that is informative whilst also being just so much fun. It was such a joy to, and I mean, even now, every time we go back to it, there's always new ways of playing with it, or new things you want to highlight, or something new you've learned that you want to get in there somehow. It's
always somebody's favorite as well. Like there's always like, sometimes people be like, I don't know whether I can laugh at this, or, you know, it does divide an audience a little bit, which is some people don't like it. I personally quite like to divide an audience. I think it's good fun. And you're wired a similar way, Kate. But yeah, there's always people who like really get it. Even if they don't have BPD or anything of the sort, there's something in it, in the human condition there, that they recognise. They don't have to have had the same experience, they get it, which is incredibly powerful. Speaking of dividing a room, though, I know that there are elements of the lecture piece, as with any humorous work, I guess, where some people may misinterpret it to be laughing at the condition rather than laughing with, which I know is something that we talked about loads in the rehearsal process, about how we could best signal that, no, this is a piece of empathy, not a judgment. But I wonder if you could speak to that, Kate, and how you walk that line, because that's obviously a big part of a comedian's job, and yet it's not an easy thing to do.
Most of the comedy that I do, I think there's always this dual line of like, I do something for humour, but then alongside that there's always vulnerability. And I think this comes across in the lecture. There's a sense of you have moments of seeing the character trapped,
yes,
or in panic, or in like very very vulnerable moments with her, which I think are the moments where the audience can know this is a real person and this experience is complex. The complex experience. And I think for me, actually, when I think about the piece, I'm like, I'd be surprised, I think, if anybody came away from it being like, oh, she's just mocking someone who has borderline personality disorder. But yeah, I think for me personally as well, it's a lot about your intention when you're making stuff. And I think it's very hard if your intention is to produce something that is like not mocking, to then end up making something that is mocking. I think that's quite difficult in some ways. I think you will always get people whose own narrative is so close to the surface that they will read it in a particular way.